There's a photograph that exists from 1951. At first glance, it's nothing remarkable. Just a man sitting in the cockpit of his aircraft, the kind of vintage snapshot you'd find in any aviation museum. But look closer. Look at the background. That massive cloud swelling behind him isn't a storm. It's a mountain tearing itself apart. The man in the photo is Tony Taylor, a volcanologist who would later receive the George Cross for his almost daily flights over an erupting volcano. The cloud behind him is Mount Lamington in Papua New Guinea, captured mid-eruption. Taylor's data collection missions would prove essential to rescue efforts in the weeks that followed. But here's the thing that makes this image so haunting. Before that cloud appeared, before the ground started shaking, before nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in a matter of minutes, no one even knew Mount Lamington was a volcano. Not the colonial administrators, not the local Orokaiva people who had lived at its base for generations, not the missionaries running schools in its shadow. The mountain's peak was covered in dense jungle, looking no different from any other mountain in the region. There were no folk stories warning of eruptions, no historical records of volcanic activity, no geological surveys marking it as a threat. For all anyone knew, Mount Lamington was just a mountain, a big, quiet, harmless mountain where you could build villages, plant crops, and raise children without a second thought. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. On the morning of January 21st, 1951, Mount Lamington exploded with almost no warning. A pyroclastic surge traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour swept across the landscape, obliterating everything within a 230 square kilometer radius. Entire villages vanished. The government station at Higaturu was wiped off the map. Bodies were found frozen in positions of sudden death, many still in the postures of sleep or morning routine. The Mount Lamington disaster remains one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions of the 20th century. And perhaps its greatest tragedy is that the warning signs were there. They just came too late, and no one knew what they meant. To understand how nearly 3,000 people could die beneath a volcano no one knew existed, you first have to understand the mountain itself. And more importantly, you have to understand why everyone trusted it. Mount Lamington rises 1,680 meters above the Oro province in what is now Papua New Guinea. In 1951, this region was under Australian administration, a colonial territory where decisions about public health, safety, and evacuation rested not with the local population, but with government officials stationed hundreds of kilometers away in Port Moresby. The people who actually lived at the mountain's base had little say in their own protection, and there seemed to be nothing to protect them from. Unlike the classic volcanic peaks you might picture, Lamington didn't look dangerous. There was no smoking crater at the summit, no bubbling hot springs on its slopes, no barren, blackened earth warning visitors away. Instead, the mountain was covered in dense, lush jungle all the way to the top. It looked like every other mountain in the hydrographer's range, just another piece of the landscape. The region wasn't exactly a stranger to volcanic activity. Mount Victory had erupted in the 1930s. Goropu showed activity in the 1940s. Both were close enough that someone, somewhere, might have thought to survey the entire area for other potential threats. But no one did. Geological surveys were expensive, and this was a remote colonial outpost. Why investigate a mountain that had never caused trouble? That lack of investigation meant a critical fact went completely unknown. Mount Lamington was an active volcano. The craters scattered throughout the hydrographer's range weren't random formations. They were evidence of ancient eruptions. Evidence that no one recognized because no one was looking. The Orokaiva people had lived around Lamington's base for generations. Their villages dotted the fertile slopes. They built homes, raised families, and farmed the rich volcanic soil without ever knowing what made that soil so fertile in the first place. There were no folk stories about the mountain exploding, no ancestral warnings passed down through generations. As far as anyone knew, Lamington had always been quiet. It would always be quiet. By 1951, the mountain's shadow held a thriving community. European missionaries ran schools and churches. The Sangara mission housed students from across the region. The government station at Higaturu served as the administrative center for the entire area, complete with offices, residences, and colonial officials going about their bureaucratic routines. Thousands of people lived, worked, and slept within the blast radius of a volcano they didn't know existed. The mountain gave no obvious warnings. The administrators had no reason to worry. The Ora Cava had no power to demand answers, even if they'd known what questions to ask. Everyone trusted the silence. Everyone assumed the quiet would last. In January 1951, the mountain finally decided to speak. January 1951 began like any other month at the base of Mount Lamington. It was summer, school holidays, and children who normally boarded at the Sangara mission had returned home to their families. The mountain's peak was often obscured by seasonal cloud cover. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Then the first week bled into the second, and the mountain started to wake up. January 15th brought the first unmistakable sign. A landslide carved brown streaks down the mountainside, where trees had torn loose from the earth and tumbled into the valleys below. White smoke began rising from the lower slopes. Not thick, not dramatic, but visible. Something was happening inside the mountain. By January 16th, more landslides appeared on the inner peaks. Tremors rippled through the ground, gentle at first, then harder to ignore. On Wednesday the 17th, volcanic emissions increased again. Smoke billowed from the summit. The earthquakes grew more frequent, more violent. Winds cleared the clouds away, and for the first time, some inhabitants could actually see what was unfolding above them. Thursday brought even greater emissions. The smoke was now impossible to miss. Some missionaries in the area began quietly preparing for a potential humanitarian crisis, gathering supplies and making contingency plans. But official action? Almost none. District Commissioner Cecil Cowley found himself facing a decision he was completely unprepared to make. He wasn't a volcanologist. He had no training in disaster management. He considered evacuating just the Europeans. He considered evacuating everyone. But consideration isn't action, and his indecision meant that no evacuation order was ever given. No one was told to leave. That Thursday, Cowley sent a radiogram to his superiors in Port Moresby. He described the tremors, the eruptions, the landslides, the smoke billowing across the northern mountainside. Then he concluded with words that would haunt the historical record forever. "Consider no need alarm," he wrote, "but you may care investigate by aircraft." The next day, newspapers published photographs of the smoking mountain, alongside reassuring statements. No deaths, no immediate danger. Friday's plume reached even greater distances. Debris began falling on Higaturu itself, collapsing roofs and sending locals fleeing. The sulfuric smell of volcanic gas spread across the region. Saturday's smoke column climbed to 30,000 feet. Radio communications with Port Moresby were hampered by static interference. That evening, witnesses reported blue flashes and red glowing material at the summit. The mountain was screaming. On Thursday, Cowley had requested a volcanologist. Instead, Judge Phillips, the acting administrator, flew in with his wife on what amounted to a sightseeing trip. He surveyed the situation, offered what observers later called lackluster advice, and told Cowley's wife that if things got violent, she should simply get in a jeep and drive to Kokoda. Then he flew back to Port Moresby. No evacuation was ordered. Thousands remained in their homes, their villages, their beds. By Saturday night, the earthquakes had finally subsided. Some took this as a sign the worst had passed. They were wrong. Sunday was coming. Sunday, January 21st, 1951. The morning dawned quieter than the days before. The earthquakes had eased. The smoke still rose from Lamington's summit, but the violent intensity of the previous week seemed to have softened. Some might have even allowed themselves a moment of relief. At 10:35 in the morning, a Qantas DC-3 was cruising through the skies on a bird of paradise flight from Port Moresby to Rabaul. The route took the aircraft through the Kokoda Gap, passing within clear view of Mount Lamington. The plane flew at just under 3,000 meters, high enough to see the landscape spreading out below, low enough to witness what came next. At 10:40, the mountain exploded. An enormous cloud erupted from the summit, expanding outward with terrifying speed. The DC-3 pilots saw it instantly, a wall of ash and gas swelling toward them faster than seemed possible. They threw the aircraft into a dive, desperate to escape the advancing cloud. They made it, barely. Below the cloud, something far more deadly was racing across the ground. A pyroclastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic debris tore down the mountainside at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Everything in its path was incinerated. A second aircraft, a DH-84 Dragon, was approaching the airstrip near Popondetta at almost the same moment. The pilots were coming into land when they saw what looked like the entire side of the mountain blowing apart. A rapidly expanding wall of destruction was surging toward them from the south. The Dragon hit full throttle and clawed back into the sky, narrowly escaping the cloud as it swept beneath them. Those pilots witnessed the end of Higaturu. The government station, the administrative heart of the region, was directly in the surge's path. Within moments, it ceased to exist. Every building, every vehicle, every person, gone. Cecil Cowley, the district commissioner, who had spent a week unable to decide whether to order an evacuation, died in the eruption he failed to prevent. The pyroclastic flow carved a path of total destruction. A shift in wind pushed the surge northward from Lamington's peak, and it didn't stop until it had traveled kilometers across the landscape. The Oracaiva settlement of Sangara was obliterated. The flow halted roughly 3 kilometers from the Sangara plantation, but everything between there and the crater was simply erased. Survivors emerged from the edges of the devastation into a world transformed. The jungle was gone. Villages were gone. People who had been alive minutes earlier were gone. Those who could still walk fled north toward Popondetta, the nearest settlement. But Popondetta offered little refuge. There were no medical facilities, virtually no radio equipment, no way to call for help, and almost nothing to offer the wounded who kept arriving throughout the day. Then, at 9 that night, Mount Lamington erupted again, this time from its southern side. The survivors huddled in darkness, ash still falling around them, wondering if the mountain would ever stop. Word of the catastrophe finally reached Port Moresby on Monday morning, January 22nd. The full scale of what had happened at Mount Lamington was only beginning to emerge, and the administration scrambled to respond. Relief efforts converged on Popondetta from 2 directions. Ships arrived at Cape Killerton along the coast. Qantas aircraft landed at the settlement's modest airstrip, bringing supplies, medical personnel, and the grim realization that this disaster was far worse than anyone had initially understood. Throughout the day, survivors kept appearing. Walking wounded stumbled out of the ash-covered wilderness, many suffering horrific burns and respiratory injuries. The most severely hurt were predominantly Oracaiva people, the indigenous population who had lived closest to the mountain and had the least warning, the least power, and the least chance of escape. Recovery teams began finding bodies. On Tuesday, burials started along the Kokoda Track. The location carried its own haunted weight. Just 10 years earlier, this same ground had been the site of brutal fighting between Australian soldiers and Japanese forces during World War II. Now, it served as a mass graveyard for victims of a different kind of war, one fought by nature against an unprepared population. The condition of the dead told the story of how they had perished. Many showed signs of asphyxiation, their lungs filled with superheated ash. Others displayed thermally induced muscle contractions, their bodies frozen in morbid fetal positions or seated postures, caught in the middle of ordinary moments when the surge overtook them. Some had clearly been asleep. The burials happened quickly, too quickly for accurate counts. The official death toll was eventually recorded as 2,942, but estimates ranged anywhere from 2,000 to over 4,000. An additional 5,000 people were left homeless. Plantation crops across the region were completely destroyed, bringing economic ruin on top of human tragedy. Amid the devastation, one man's work would prove extraordinary. Volcanologist Tony Taylor began flying daily observation sorties over Mount Lamington while it was still actively erupting. His data collection missions, conducted at tremendous personal risk, provided critical information that helped direct rescue operations and ultimately saved lives. He would later receive the George Cross for his bravery. But the relief efforts faced constant setbacks. In early February, the Kamusi River, choked with volcanic debris washing down from Lamington, burst its banks and flooded the refugee area at Wairopi. A new camp had to be established at Ilimo. By May, most survivors had finally been processed and relocated to newly built settlements. When newspapers covered the disaster, their focus revealed the colonial reality. Headlines concentrated on the 30-some European dead and missing. That figure represented barely 1% of the total losses. The thousands of Oroquiva victims received far less attention. The administration faced harsh criticism for its complete lack of preparedness. Judge Phillips, the man who had flown in for a sightseeing tour and advised against evacuation, later admitted his decision had been wrong. A very bloody one, he reportedly acknowledged. The mountain had warned them for a week. No one had listened. When Mount Lamington finally stopped erupting in 1956, it had taught the world lessons written in ash and blood. Nearly 3,000 lives lost. Entire communities erased. A government station vanished so completely that bodies had to be exhumed and reburied with proper rites years later. The photographs taken during and after the eruption became vital study materials for volcanologists worldwide. Every image of that expanding cloud, every documented account of the pyroclastic surge, every record of the week-long warning signs that went unheeded, all of it contributed to our understanding of how volcanoes behave and how disasters unfold when preparation fails. Papua New Guinea would eventually gain independence from Australia in 1975, 2 decades after Lamington went quiet. The Oroquiva people rebuilt. New settlements rose along the Kokoda Track. Life returned to the shadow of the mountain that had betrayed everyone's trust. But the lessons of Lamington extend far beyond volcanic science. This was a disaster enabled by assumption. The assumption that a jungle-covered mountain couldn't be dangerous. The assumption that the absence of historical records meant the absence of risk. The assumption that colonial administrators hundreds of kilometers away knew better than the people living at the mountain's base. The assumption that a week of escalating warnings could be monitored rather than acted upon. Cecil Cowley, the district commissioner who couldn't decide whether to evacuate, died in the eruption he failed to prevent. Judge Phillips, who flew in for a sightseeing tour and advised against evacuation, lived to admit his advice had been catastrophically wrong. The Oroquiva people, who had no power to make decisions about their own safety, paid the highest price of all. Today, Mount Lamington is monitored. Its volcanic nature is known, documented, respected. But around the world, communities still live in the shadows of mountains, coastlines, and fault lines, trusting that the quiet will last. If the ground beneath your feet started trembling tomorrow, would anyone tell you to leave? And if they didn't, would you know to go anyway?